Video, we're going to be looking at the second part of Revolutionary America, the Young Republic. Now, yesterday we talked about the Revolutionary War and how America went from these colonies of discontent to colonies that were willing to sacrifice treason to gain independence. So today's focus is on what happens afterwards. So first thing we're going to talk about is how we start to govern ourselves after we gain independence. And the very first governing document was not the Constitution, it was the Articles of Confederation or Articles of Confederacy. It establishes the United States as a confederacy, not to be confused with the Civil War Confederacy, although there are some similarities. In a confederacy, you have an alliance of tribes or people or states that come together and work for a common purpose. In this case, it is to organize and govern this new country. For the Civil War, it was to resist the Union. So, what this means is that we were so, hung over from the idea of having a monarch, having one person in charge, that we decided to go with this confederacy type government, which gives much more power to the legislature being those that make laws, that we pretty much cut out the whole judicial, the people that judge laws, or the executive, the person who enforces the law. The Articles of Confederation was mainly a legislative government and gave much more power to the state governments, which were mostly legislative governments, than to anything like a national government. Now, under this Articles of Confederation, the AOC there, they could make war and make peace treaties if 9 out of the 13 agreed on things. Most things had to have a 9 out of 3 or a supermajority, which is rare. They could borrow money, they could establish money, but they never really did the establishing part because every state had its own currency, which was horrible if you were a traveling salesman. They could govern public land, and this is probably one of the only great things that comes out of the Articles of Confederation is the organizing of land. Now, if you'll remember back yesterday when we talked about the ending of that war and how America gained this territory from the British, this area south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River, the big question is, what do we do with this territory? Do we just extend the states as they were all the way to the Mississippi River? That was kind of an idea that you see floated here. Or do we create new states? And so the idea is we're going to create new states rather than expanding the existing ones. So we'll have new states like Tennessee there in 1796 and Kentucky in 1792 and more states to come. We're not just going to extend the 13 and keep them forever. As we expand westward and as those areas gain more population, we'll have a set of rules and criteria that those areas have to meet before they can become their own states. So that's a pretty cool thing. That's how we come up with the idea of new states rather than expanding states. And lastly, though, the Articles of Confederation could not tax or raise an army. Most of the money that a national government would get was through the selling of land. But they couldn't raise an army. They were basically required or relying on state militia. If the Spanish down here got a wild hair up their butt and decided to invade Georgia, there was no national army to deal with that. The idea was we'll get the militias of states together to come and take care of that problem. And again, that's just not a very feasible thing to think about or base your whole national security on is state militia. So there's a lot of things it couldn't do, and obviously this has some issues with it. And despite the good thing it did with public land, one of the bad things that happens under the Articles of Confederation has to do with something known as Shays' Rebellion. Because this weak central government was unable to handle large nationwide problems, what happens if Spain invades Georgia? the big thing that, the straw that breaks the camel's back as far as people's awareness of how weak this government is Shays' Rebellion, when very heavily taxed Massachusetts farmers have had enough and decide to rebel. And, a guy named Daniel Shay gets a large amount of very angry farmers together and decides to march on, the government of Massachusetts there, some of the local governments there. Those governments freak out. And so they call out to, the president, and the National Army to help, and nothing happens because there is no real president or national army under the Articles of Confederation. Again, it puts pretty much all power into the legislative, the lawmaking, but there is no president, there is no national army. And so it's the state militias that are forced to come up with the funds and money to pay for, state troops to hold off this rebelling mob and put it down. And it does, fairly quickly, but it does open up the issue of, wow, that was a close one. What if it happens again? What if it's bigger next time? This new government is too weak. And again, many felt that it was too weak to handle internal problems. And so enough of the fancy enlightened people of this time, what we call our founding fathers, decide, what, let's meet together and let's fix the Articles of Confederation. So they will all gather in Philadelphia for a convention. Delegates from 12 of the 13 states, because Rhode Island thought it was worthless and too much trouble and, waste of time to do this. And if it was just revising the Articles of Confederation, they may have been right that it was a waste of time. Because as the delegates get to Philadelphia and start trying to work out ways to revise and fix the Articles of Confederation, they realize the problem with the Articles of Confederation is the Articles of Confederation. I mean, the problem is the thing itself, and there's no fixing it. And so they basically, give up, scrap it. Let's start fresh from a new government, a new governing document, and that's when the Constitution comes in. Now, I'm not getting into the Constitution with you in this video. You guys have, went over the Constitution in your civics classes. Hopefully you know the three branches of government and what powers each branch have and all that good stuff. I'm going to assume that you know that as we move forward with the next part when talking about the first executive to hold that office of president, and that is George Washington, the guy that you see pictured there on the top left and has been there since we started this lesson. So when George Washington becomes president, one of the first things that he does is set up his executive department, sometimes referred to as the cabinet. These are going to be departments in the national government that will advise the president and help him carry out his duties. All right. And there are 15 of those departments today, but back then they just had 4. But we're not going to talk about the Postmaster General here. We're just going to focus on the Department of State, headed by Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, the Department of War, headed by Secretary of War Henry Knox, and the Department of Treasury, headed by the Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, a guy so famous he has his own Broadway play going on that's very, very popular, and he's the guy on the $10 bill. And while you guys pause for a minute to think about, wait, that's the guy on the $10 bill? I thought it was a president. Pull out your $10 bills if you have one, find it, that's the guy, Alexander Hamilton. So what's he doing on our money? Well, it's Alexander Hamilton who has more to do with the nation's finances and banking and economy, being the Secretary of the Treasury. And so he is the guy that comes up with an economic plan to deal with the nation's huge debt problem, because we had fought a kind of a war of independence recently, and wars cost money. And the nation is deeply in debt. So he breaks it into 3 simple strategies, 3 simple steps here. First part of his plan is the national government is going to take on all state debt. So whether it's North Carolina and Virginia, or New York and Massachusetts, all that state debt that they had prior to the Constitution, we're going to take all that debt, put it in one giant collective pot. Now it's the national debt, and we're going to work on paying it off together. We're also going to establish a national bank set up to organize the finances and establish one currency. Instead of having 13 different currencies, let's have one. That'll make things simple. And unlike the Articles of Confederation that could not tax, this one can tax. It's also going to start to impose tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, things that come into the country. And it's going to regulate trade so that, states in the South aren't carelessly trying to import goods from Britain that they could be getting from their friendly state neighbors to the north. Or the northern states, aren't trying to get cotton from Europe when they can get it from their friendly state neighbors in the South. Let's regulate some trade here. All sounds great. This is putting a lot more power on a national government, as you can tell. So we're kind of getting away from this weak central government. Much stronger national government here is able to do some things. But the problem with this plan is the South won't go for it. The South refused this plan as the debt was mostly northern debt that was going to get paid off, and they thought this was unfair. That would be like all of you in the classroom right now hearing my voice. Let's say you all owed me $100, and while the first two rows you've already paid $90 of that debt, you still owe $10. Now rows 3 through 5, you also owe $100, but you've only paid $10. You still owe $90. And here comes, the federal government saying, don't worry about your debt. Let's all bring the debt together and we'll pay it off together. That sounds great if you're the northern people who've only paid $10. Oh, great. The national government's going to help pay the other $90. That's awesome. Those of you that have already paid $90 and only have $10 left to pay feel like you're getting the short end of the stick here. Wait, I paid most of my debt. Now we're going to start collecting taxes, and most of that tax revenue is going to be going to pay northern debt. That ain't fair. And so they demand something more out of this deal, and a compromise is needed. That compromise is reached when the South gets something in return. The idea is that we're going to move the national capital to the South, in a new town that's going to be born out of a swamp, essentially called Foggy Bottom, that rests between the Maryland and Virginia borders. We're going to call it a new city, the city of Washington, named after the first president. And the D.C. is added because it's not part of either state, it's its own district. And we're going to call it the District of Columbia because Columbia was a very popular name at the time. There was a small faction of people who thought America should be called Columbia after Columbus rather than Amerigo Vespucci. And so this was kind of a bone thrown their way. Let's call it the District of Columbia. With all that said, we moved the capital. The capital used to be in New York. That's where Washington took his first oath of office. And so it was in New York, and then it got moved to Philadelphia temporarily before it got moved to Washington, D.C. permanently. So the South gets something out of this. All right. The second thing to mention there is that whole collecting taxes thing, because that's going to become another issue. Very similar situation to what happened under the Articles of Confederation with Shays' Rebellion. A similar rebellion happens again over here. This time it's Pennsylvania farmers who are rebelling over taxes. And unlike with the Articles of Confederation, when these Pennsylvania farmers start to march on the government, the state government there in Pennsylvania, and the people in Pennsylvania freak out and they call the president and ask that the National Army be sent out, there's actually a president to answer the metaphorical phone and an army to send their way. And to add insult to injury for the people of Pennsylvania, it's George Washington that's going to be leading that army because his former occupation was general, and so as commander-in-chief, he was more than ready to lead those troops. And when the people of Pennsylvania found out that a national army was headed their way, headed by none other than famed war hero George Washington, they put down their pitchforks and guns and decided, we'll go home and pay our taxes. And so At the end of the day, the Whiskey Rebellion essentially proves that unlike the Articles of Confederation, this new government is going to work and this national government can enforce its laws. All right, this new government is going to work. Same situation, same problem as before, but this time a different outcome. All right, so that is what Washington is doing on the home front or the domestic front, but he's also challenged by foreign affairs. Britain and France are at war during the French Revolution, with America kind of caught in the middle. Those of you that had European history or world history may remember that in the late 1700s, time period we're talking about here, the French Revolution is going on in Europe. So this is similar to many of you may have found yourself in the situation as teenagers where you have two friends who decide to get into a disagreement or a fight, and there you are stuck in the middle with both sides, both friends, asking you to support their side. Now, most people will tell you the best thing to do in that course is to stay out of it. That's what Washington tries to do. Well, we're friends with both the British and the French, and so he sees an opportunity here to claim neutrality. We're going to avoid the conflict with either nation. We're not going to fight with either one of you. We're friends with both. We're staying out of it. And like sometimes what might happen with some of your friends, one friend's okay with that, but the other friend not so much. In this case, Britain is the friend who's not okay with this. And they begin seizing U.S. ships bound for France, basically with the idea of, we're at war with France and we don't like you trading with them. We don't want you to play with them on the playground, essentially. And the British also, in those forts in the Northwest Territory, again, this was that land that was given to us after the war was over, the War of Independence. Well, there are some British forts here where the British would still occupy them. It's U.S. territory, but the British are still there. They haven't left yet. And we believe they're up there stirring up Indians and causing trouble on the frontier. And of course, this can't go unnoticed or undealt with. And so Washington sends an ambassador, a young delegation to Britain to work out a deal, try to, calm things down. And he comes back with a treaty that avoided a major war at this time. The British have to leave those Northwest forts, according to this treaty, and pay for the damages they have caused to the ships they've been seizing and taking our stuff. In return, the United States has got to pay their pre-Revolutionary War debt off still. Again, just because you move out of your parents' house and you owed your parents a lot of money doesn't mean you don't still owe them money after you leave the house. Just because we're independent doesn't mean we don't still owe Britain the money we owed them before we became independent. So we've got to pay that off still. And we have to slightly restrict our trade with France. So this is a band-aid on the situation. It will get much worse as we go through the next decade. And the next 3 presidents have to deal with this issue of Britain and France at war with each other, not liking each other, and the United States caught in the middle. So Washington himself will serve 2 terms. A term is 4 years, so he'll serve 8 years. He could have ran for a 3rd term. He really didn't even want to run for the 2nd term, but he was talked into it. He's had enough. But before Washington leaves the scene in his presidency, he issues a farewell address in which he talks a lot about the future of the country and what he hopes to see it do. But he also issues 2 warnings, and we're going to look at those real quickly here before we finish this lesson. His first warning, this is just a segment of it here, of his farewell address. It says, quote, "One of the expedients of parties to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourself too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on the geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. Generally, it serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. All right, so what's Washington warning us here about? He is warning us about the dangers of forming political parties. All right, Washington himself was very much against the idea of political parties. He felt like they did more to divide the nation than unite the nation. So he's warning us against the problems that parties will represent each other and just do horrible things to gain attention to their cause and make the other side look like the devil incarnate. And so this misrepresentation that both sides do to each other is just not good. It's not healthy. It turns American against American. People that should be mutually bound together under fraternity and brotherhood, kind of turn on each other, and it's not healthy for our country. And we listened really well to that, obviously. His second warning, we actually listened to for a lot longer. We listened to it for about 100 years. This first warning we listened to for about as long as it takes Washington to, leave the front door before we're already talking about political parties forming. More on that in the next unit. But this next warning is see if we can figure out what he's talking about. So likewise, a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and the excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side, and serve to veil and even second the arts of influence on the other. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence, she, referring to Europe, must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our own concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in her politics, or the ordinary combination and collusions of her friendships or enmities. Why forego the advantages of so a peculiar situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? It is only true policy to steer. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. So far, as we are now at liberty to do it. That one's a little bit on the nose, pretty easy one to figure out what he's talking about there. He's warning about the dangers of getting involved in foreign alliances or entangling alliances that might draw the United States into conflict. In his mind, it's best we stay out of European conflicts and treaties and alliances. Europe has its own concerns and problems. We don't need to get tangled up in their issues and problems. Let them deal with themselves. All right, and we listened pretty good to that until the First World War. But that will do it for our first section talking about the Young Republic. All right, so thank you guys for viewing and listening, and I will see you tomorrow.